everybody. Welcome to Middle East Conversation 2020. أهلا وسهلا فيكم جميعا على محادثات الشرق الأوسط 2020. هيدا لقائنا السادس والأخير لهالسنة. This is our sixth and final conversation for this year of 2020. I'm going to give quick instructions in Arabic for those who will be following this conversation in the Arabic language. So please, English speakers, bear with me. كلمة وجيزة للمشاركين باللغة العربية. نطلب منكم إنه إذا بتحبوا تتابعوا هالمحادثة باللغة العربية بالترجمة الفورية إنكم تنزلوا على الكبسة يلي بتقول interpretation بزوم وتكبسوا على Arabic بهيدا الخيار يلي هو Arabic حتى تصيروا تسمعوا الترجمة من اللغة الإنجليزية للغة العربية خلال هالمحادثات. برحب فيكم بحييكم وهلا رح ارجع اقلب للغة الإنجليزية فيما تبقى من هاللقاء بهالنهار. I am back in the English language and I welcome you again. I am very glad for all of those who have been able to join us. I would like you to know that over 200 people registered for this conversation, which has been the highest number for this year. So clearly we have a very important topic that has drawn a lot of interest. I would like to welcome, however, the 120 people who are with us already this evening, at least this evening my time. If it is your morning, good morning. And we expect that some more people will be joining us as the event goes along. The genesis of the present gathering is connected to the writing or collection of a book under the same title as this gathering, which is The Religious Other. In 2018 and 2019, we held two separate conversations or consultations. The first was on a biblical view of the religious other in 2018. And then the following year in 2019, we zeroed in, we focused on the topic of Islam and Muslims as the religious other. We then decided to put together a volume, bringing together the various papers that had been presented, as well as reflect the various conversations that had taken place between participants in that consultation. I would like to give you a little bit about the rationale of why we thought that this topic is important. Understanding the religious other, of course, is extremely important for our world today, but also connected with that, the idea of developing a biblical understanding or a theology of the religious other. There are many issues these days in our various faith traditions. Among evangelicals in recent years, there have been certain controversial issues. I'll just mention, for instance, the question of the contextualized Bible translations in Arabic. In other words, translations of the Bible that are more focused on the readership, including Muslim as well as Christian potential readers of the text. Some people say you should stick to a literal translation of the Bible. You should not focus on the audience, but on the text itself, because it is the word of God. Another big issue, for instance, has been the question of the insider movement. To what extent should a Muslim who becomes a disciple of Jesus leave their background, or not only a Muslim, but a Jewish person or someone from any other religion? And the question is, always connected in our understanding to your view. In the end, it boils down to your view and your understanding of the religious other. The more you have a negative view of the religious other, the less you will be likely to accept connections, ongoing connections with the religious other. The more you are able to see the religious other in all of his and her complexity and diversity, the more you will be open to a continued interaction with them and continued connection in loving harmony with them. So the approach that we have proposed as a framework for this book has been tested extensively through our Institute of Middle East Studies at ABTS over the past 17 years. We have found it useful in our engagement with Muslims through multiple initiatives that we've been engaged in, from academic study and research to interfaith dialogue to peace building. We have found the following useful: the framework that we are using in this book. The framework is what I refer to as the charismatic attitude and approach to Islam and Muslims. In my introduction to this book, as the co-editor of the volume, I elaborate on the approach through three pairs of characteristics, which I describe as the supra-religious and Christ-centered approach. That is one that is focused on Christ and Christ as a person rather than Christianity as a religious institution. Secondly, the pair of respect and love. And thirdly, calling for a prophetic stance and a scientific honesty in the study of religion. These three pairs of characteristics are meant to establish the spirit, the tone, and the foundation of this book that we are launching tonight or today, for those of you for whom it's morning. They also announce that the concept of the religious other throughout the chapters will be examined through biblical, theological, ethical, academic, and other sorts of lenses. In the second part of the book, which reflects primarily the consultation of 2019, and in chapters 5 to 9 in particular, these chapters form the core of the volume. They address 5 components of what I call the Islamic phenomenon. The first is the emergence of Islam. The second, the Quran. The third issue is Muhammad. The fourth, salvation. And the fifth, the spiritual realm. Each component is explored through biblical, theological, Islamological, historical, ethical, ministerial lenses by experts in these various fields. The multidisciplinary nature of the book is probably one of its most notable and most important characteristics. To thank deeply Langham Publishers, who have very kindly offered a 30% discount on the book purchase through their website to all webinar attendees. So now we have 151 people together, you'll be glad to know that you will receive a personalized discount code over the next few days. So look out for it. It will come to you probably from the same address that approved and sent you a link to attend this webinar. I'm also very grateful to ABTS and some of our partners who have helped me personally to clear some time in my schedule over the past year. Chaotic as it has been, as you probably all know, in Lebanon, and it's sometimes been difficult to focus, but I'm very grateful to friends, partners, and to God and to my family for the ability to complete the editing of the volume. I also want to add that without my co-editor, Jonathan Andrews, who has become a well-known figure for our Institute of Middle East Studies and has edited a number of previous books that have been contributed by our faculty and center. And Jonathan, I'm sure you are in the audience, and I want to thank you so much for your fantastic work. There's no way that the book would have come to light as quickly as it did without Jonathan Andrews. Now, I want to open a parenthesis and say that if you find any problems at all in the book, please blame it on Jonathan Andrews. And all good things, you can attribute these to me. Thank you also to Langham team, who have been extremely supportive throughout the process. What we're going to do now is we are going to have a quick poll, just to break the ice a little bit. You're going to see on your screen in a minute. Oh, by the way, Jonathan Andrews just added in the Q&A section that he agrees with what I just said. So he's happy to take the blame. So you now see in front of you a poll with 3 simple questions. And we're going to ask you to do this as a fun thing. We've been doing every conversation for the past 5 times. And you will see the results immediately after we close it in a couple of minutes. So please go ahead now. And the question is, I believe that Christian-Muslim relations have improved in recent times. Do you strongly agree? Do you agree? Are you neutral about it? Do you disagree, or do you strongly disagree? Please click one box. The second question is, if I have a negative view of Islam, I am likely to be more antagonistic to Muslims. Do you strongly agree with this statement? Do you agree? Do you feel neutral about it? Do you disagree, or do you strongly disagree? And the third and final question is, when engaging in conversation with Muslims, Christians must, and please select, Christians must focus mainly on commonalities between us. Christians must focus on both commonalities and differences, or thirdly, Christians must focus mainly on differences. We'll give you another 5 to 10 seconds, and then you will see the results of this poll before we move to the next part of our conversation. Okay, so we have a small majority that believe that Christian-Muslim relations have improved in recent times, and closely followed by people who disagree with that statement, and a middle ground, a middle number of people who are neutral about it. So it seems that there's a sense that people are not quite sure whether Christian-Muslim relations have improved or not in recent times, and we are quite divided as a group about this question, and that's perfectly okay. On the second point, on the connection between the negative view towards Islam and the likelihood of us having a more antagonistic relationship with Muslims, there is a majority that agree with that statement. So they see a link between our view of Islam and our engagement with Muslims. However, there is also a significant number of people, 28%, who strongly agree. Yeah, so we have about 60, 70, 76, 72% of us either agree or strongly agree with the fact that there is a link between our beliefs and our practices. And that is actually interesting because it's one of the main arguments of the book. And then considering what we need to do about it. And to the third question about what we should do when engaging in conversation with Muslims, 81%, an overwhelming majority, believe that we should focus both on commonalities and differences. 19% believe we should focus mainly on commonalities, and 1%, where are you in the audience, who believe that we should focus mainly on differences. So thank you very much for taking part in this fun little poll that reflects a little bit who is in this group during this conversation. I would like now to introduce to you our next 3 panelists, and I'm going to invite 3 panelists to join me. And as we begin to speak together, I want to remind you or inform you as participants, as an audience, that there is the feature of Q&A in Zoom, and we invite you to ask questions to our panelists related to our conversation, and or to make brief remarks if you would like. As you know, you will not be able to come live into the conversation because of the size of the group, but we would love to receive your questions or comments and to pass them on to our panelists. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to divide our time now between keynotes and then Q&A. I'm going to integrate all of that. And so I'm going to be asking questions of my guests, and then from time to time, I will pick up a question that I see in the Q&A portion or window, and I will ask it to our panelists. So please feed me with your questions. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome our three main panelists. I'd like to welcome Colin Chapman. Hello, Colin. I see
Hi.
you. Thank you for joining us from the UK, around Cambridge, I believe. And Colin, for those of you who do not know him, is a respected authority in the field of Islamic studies. He has invested the major part of his life on the study of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations, both in the Middle East and in Europe. He has lived and taught in Lebanon for many years, both at the Near East School of Theology and at our institution, the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary. Until only recently, he jointly taught with me a course on Islam in our master's program. If you're interested in reading things he has written, his main book, I believe, on Islam is Cross and Crescent, but I appreciate also his book, Islam and the West. If you want to know anything balanced about the Israeli-Palestinian question, I highly recommend Whose Promised Land, also by Colin Chapman. Thank you, Colin, for joining us. Our second guest is Ida Glasser. Ida Glasser heads up the Oxford Center for Muslim Christian Studies in the city of Oxford, naturally, and she's joining us today also from the UK. Like Colin, Ida is therefore joining from the UK, and she's an expert in Islamic studies and in Old Testament studies. Some of the most profound reflections on the Bible that interrelate with Islamic concepts and with the Quran I have received from Ida Glasser. A significant book of hers is entitled Thinking Biblically About Islam. So as you can see, the book we're launching tonight is not alone in that field by any stretch of the imagination. Ida, in her book, adopts a very biblical, exegetical angle to a reflection on the nature of Islam and its relationship with the biblical tradition. And so, welcome, Ida, and thank you so much for joining us as well on this panel. Our third guest is Daniel Brown. Daniel, or Dan, for those who want to address him in a more familiar way. By the way, you'll notice that we are very informal during this conversation. I've used no title, no reverence, no doctors, no professors, because by doing so, we are acknowledging and respecting the humanity of the person in front of us, the other. Daniel is the founder and director of a research center for the study of religion in the Middle East. He's based in Istanbul. We're currently, him and I, teaching a course together, actually, in our MREL program in Islamic Studies. When Colin graciously asked to be excused from teaching that module with me, I turned to Dan, and he was very gracious also to accept to join me in teaching that course in our MREL, Middle East and North African Studies. One of the most influential books that Dan has written is entitled a new introduction to Islam. We actually were using this book as a textbook in our course on Islam together with Colin before I had ever met Dan and before Dan became uh, uh, one of the teachers of that course. Ida and Dan have each contributed more than one chapter in the present book. Colin has endorsed it enthusiastically, and previously he was a keynote speaker at MECs that we held at the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary. All three guests have been close friends of mine, they've been mentors for me, and they have offered great counsel over the past years. And that statement just made me feel much younger. It's a great honor and a privilege for me to host them on this conversation platform today. So thank you. And if we were live, I would say, join me in welcoming them. We're going to start, Colin, Ida, and Dan. I'm going to launch straight into the conversation. And I would like to ask Colin to reflect on the following. What is it, Colin, that has happened in your own life that has brought you to the place today where you're able and have the desire even to think theologically about Islam? Speak to us about your experience. Inspire us.
Thank you, Martin. My story begins in Egypt in the, I'm afraid this is ancient history, but it begins in the late 60s when I was working there and had the privilege to meet Kenneth Cragg and sit at his feet. So that was a really very formative stage in my own experience. But the second informative and influential stage was in Beirut. I arrived in Beirut with my family in 1975, 6 months after the civil war began. And very quickly, I was working with Christian students, not only in Lebanon, but throughout the Middle East with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. And very quickly, I began to understand the difficulties that Christians in the Middle East have in understanding Islam, relating to Muslims and explaining their faith to Muslims. And it was that pushed me in 4 different directions. The first was the academic study of Islam, and I started taking some courses at the Neary School of Theology, which was just round the corner from our student center in Ras Beirut. Secondly, to thinking biblically about Islam, and the very first thing I wrote on the subject was an article in Themelios, an IFES theological journal, with that title, Thinking Biblically About Islam. The third was preparing simple study material to help Christian students in these areas. And I suppose throughout my working life since then, one of my main concerns has been teaching Christians about Islam and trying to understand their problems and their difficulties in getting to grips with the subject. But the fourth significant thing is that because we were living through the civil war in Beirut at the time, I really had to try and figure out what's this civil war all about. And it was that drove me to understand what the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is all about. So these are the 4 things taken together that have inspired me. And it was all in Beirut that this happened. And that's where the formative work went on. And really what I've been doing since then in teaching in the UK and in other contexts really began in that particular context.
Well, it's so wonderful to hear that Lebanon has been an inspiration and an influence on your life, Colin. You mentioned the Neary School of Theology and the beginning of your journey of inspiration in those areas. It's very close to where I was born, so I'm glad that this neighborhood was an inspiration to you. And So if I may ask also maybe a similar question to Ida and Dan. And Ida and Dan, you both have contributed chapters to this volume. And we just heard from two global church leaders, Henry and Sasan, about the importance of that volume for the church globally. And as two authors that have contributed to the book, what would you like to highlight as your most significant contribution to the volume? And also, in light of that same question of what has brought you to this place where you want to think theologically about Islam? Not many people are doing that, neither in the practical ministry of the church nor among theologians. So it seems in some ways that it's a new field, but uh, as we've seen, Colin began to think about that a long time ago. Aida, you have a book under a similar title. Uh, so it's not. Um, I think it's not new in the sense that you have theological reflections on Islam since the medieval period among Arabic-speaking and Syriac-speaking Christians from as early as Islam's emergence. But there seems to be a growth of that interest today. And so we are going to speak a little bit about that and why and what does that mean and how can we serve that desire and need that seems to be growing in the church. But before we get into that, Ida, what is it that you would like to highlight? What do you think is an important contribution you've made to this volume?
Well, thanks, Martin. I think that for the first part, a major contribution to that first consultation is that in terms of biblical studies, we need to normalize the religious world. So I think one of the reasons why we're having to do some very explicit work trying to think biblically about Islam is because a lot of the evangelical biblical studies have assumed that the norm is either a Christian world or a secular world. Mm. And therefore, people have not known how to use the Bible in their thinking about Islam. So one of the things that I have tried to do increasingly over the last years is to realize that the Bible is written into a religious world. And the Bible assumes that the normal of humankind is to be religious. And from that, the specific call of the biblical Israel and then the call to Christ is something special that's going on within that religious world. And the secular background for so much of current biblical studies is a really unusual thing. And how did I get into that? Well, I was asked some years ago to write a book on theology of religions. And I can remember, Colin, you advising me against doing that and saying, look, Ida, you're specializing in the Muslim-Christian interface. You should keep on that. Why spend time doing this general biblical thing? But I felt a huge call from God to focus on the Bible. And it was what, a year after that book was published, I had a head injury which triggered huge trauma. So I was really unable to function very much. And as I came back towards functioning, I was saying to God, okay, I've got 10% of my capacity. What shall I do? And the answer was very clear: focus on the Bible. With my trauma, I couldn't focus on studying the academic books. And the academic field changes all the time, but the Bible doesn't change. Mm. So if I could add, in terms of the second conference, I think the major contribution there, and this is a direction I've been going to more and more in my own thinking, is that if we want to think theologically about Islam, we have to think theologically about Judaism alongside Islam, because arguably Christianity and Judaism, Christianity and Islam are two ways from different contexts and different times of universalizing the faith of the Jewish faith in the one God. So we need to think not only what has Christianity done with that, and how does Christianity relate to other forms of Judaism, but how does Islam relate to Judaism? And if we get that triangle, that is a necessary basis for our theological and biblical thinking about Islam.
Thank you, Ida, for that. And if you allow me, I'd like to ask you a little bit further to connect the dots, because not everyone here has had the opportunity to go through the text as an editor, as I have. But could you connect the dot a little bit more between the understanding that we belong to a religious world and how that affects the way that we view the religious other?
Okay. It means that we view religious people as normal people, all religious people. And one of the things I don't like about the book is the title. I don't think the religious other is other. I think that's, to think of religious people as other is already losing the battle. So if we read the Bible with the idea that all the people that it's talking about are religious people, and the Jewish people who are called are constantly interacting with people of other religions and constantly being pulled towards other religions. That's the whole backdrop. So it's normal. This is the world that we live in.
Thank you. That's very helpful, actually. And if we hadn't called it the religious other, you could not have made that insightful comment for us to get a bit closer to where you are. Dan, I'm going to maybe focus my question a little bit more, just in order not to leave it just general. But one of the most striking characteristics in your approach to Islam, which is highlighted in your chapter on both the one on Islam's emergence and the one on the Quran, is your claim to how very little we actually can know for certain about early Islam, about the person of Muhammad, and about the origins of the Quran. But instead of inviting your reader to use this information to discredit Islam, you call us to what you call a humble historical agnosticism. Tell us a little bit more about this concept. Why this position, and how have you found it useful, and how do you invite us to find it useful ourselves? A humble historical agnosticism.
Well, thank you for reminding me of that phrase. I would not have remembered it myself. But I won't disown it. I do, yeah. I think that both of my contributions actually ended up at exactly the same point, and that was a call for humility in our approach towards Islam. Now, I think most Christians will take it as a given that in our interpersonal relations, we're called to humility, but this was something more I was calling for, and that was a humility, an intellectual humility, the kind of humility that we have when we exercise true hospitality towards someone else. That is, taking on the role of service, of being not superior to them or passing judgment on them, but welcoming them to our table. And so, you know, if we think of that in intellectual terms, and that, by the way, was, I think, one of the great themes of Kenneth Craig's work, which I commend, intellectual hospitality that he calls us to. But the way that I think that I got to that point was slow and long. In other words, part of it is a long time studying Islam and coming to terms with really how little we do know, and then asking myself, partly with the help of the conference, that is needing to think through this, asking myself, what are then the implications for a Christian in terms of how much we don't know? And you know, one possible approach, and a common approach actually, is overconfidence. That is, we take the little bit that we do think we know, and we extrapolate on it. And we see this kind of overconfidence in a whole variety of human endeavors, right? That is, that we take a little bit and we believe that we've captured something really significant, and so then we extrapolate it. And I really felt that actually in this case, the opposite was necessary, to emphasize how much we really don't know, because that's realistic, and then to put that to use in terms of shaping our attitude and encouraging humility in us. So I think that sort of summarizes the approach I was trying to take.
I think the reason why I picked up that statement is because I think that so much of interaction between members of different faiths can be competitive. And in some ways, competition comes from the conviction that you are the best. And so it's anything but humility. And so I think you're calling for something quite different. Did you feel that during that consultation, there were disagreements? Was anyone disagreeing with what was being said? Were there different views represented in the conference that we will find again in the book? Or was everyone in agreement? Is there only one way of seeing things?
Oh, actually, I would say that one of the great strengths of the book was, first of all, that it's written from such a variety of different methodological and disciplinary perspectives. So to have the biblical studies, theological reflections, but also sociological and historical, all put together, it actually has a greater breadth than a lot of treatments. In other words, I would have said, actually, in thinking about it, I'll critique the title as well, that it's more than aiming at a biblical theology of Islam, right? It's doing more than that, because incorporated in it is a desire for a biblically based ethic in relation to Islam, biblical ways of thinking in relation to Islam that in some ways transcend how we normally think about theology. And so, you know, it has guidance for the practitioner as well as the theologian. And so that's a great strength. But of course, there's diversity. And then I would say that there's actually probably significant even disagreement among the contributors on certain issues. And I'll point out the one that's most likely actually to be problematic to some readers, and that is soteriology. We may bring that up more in my view, the soteriological chapter section of the book is in many respects the weakest, by necessity, because you would need a whole book, right? But also because you know, I think probably more care would have had to go into that. That goes to the really the heart of the theological problem, it seems to me. And so I think more is needed. You can have another set of conferences and another book on that topic. But that's the one that I think is likely to have created the greatest divergence.
I think I would agree with you, Dan. And just to clarify for those who are less familiar with more technical terms, soteriology is the doctrine of salvation. So the question of salvation, I agree with you, I think is probably one of the big issues that needs to be addressed far more robustly in the years ahead, because what we have, it seems to me, is a delving of theologians from the evangelical world into the field of interfaith engagement, interfaith dialogue. And I know that for people like you and you know, Daniel and Ida and Colin, I mean, you've been at it for 50 years. And so for you, it's not new, but I'm speaking about the evangelical church more globally, more generally, as a body. I think that we have entered the game of dialogue and of engagement in more recently than other traditions, including within the more mainline Protestant tradition. And I don't think we have come to terms with the question of salvation. And that's why I would agree with you that we barely scratched the surface during that conference, and as will come through in the book. And certainly, I think there's a place for a good, robust conversation and engagement from different angles, you know, theology and missiology and Islamic studies and comparative theology and all of that on that question of soteriology. So thank you for highlighting that. Ida, what would you like to be critical about concerning this book, apart from the title?
I think at this stage, I don't really want to be critical. I haven't been able to absorb it all because I don't read well online, so I'm waiting till I get hold of it. Because I think it's the sort of book that needs to be listened to rather than needs to be criticized. So we need to appreciate that there are lots of different people coming from lots of different directions, and to appreciate the medium and the mixture in there of the different voices. So I think if we take it as a resource with listening to these different voices, it's going to be hugely useful. If we want it to answer the questions, then we could be very critical.
Yeah. There will always remain unanswered questions.
There will always remain unanswered. There will always be lots of ends that are not tied up.
Yes.
So I would just be very positive as something to be listened to, and if anybody wants to do better, then may they do so.
Okay, thank you. That's a very wise diplomatic answer, especially for a book where you have a couple of or even 3 chapters. So let's listen. We invite the church to listen to these voices. Colin, are you still with us? Because I don't see your image anymore. And there you are. Wonderful. And Colin, I wanted to ask you a further question related to this. And I want to convey a question from the audience. And this question comes from Cynthia Cruz Datu. And she asks, in our efforts to contextualize, what controls can we use so that we avoid over-contextualization? And to reframe a little bit that question, so we're saying that the book is proposing a path which is somewhat a little bit different from the usual more conservative evangelical approach. Colin, you have experience in that field. What controls would you recommend in order to avoid going too far in the other direction that evangelicals have been cautious about in the past?
I think the main thing I would say is listening to people in other contexts. And I really wanted to say that one of the most exciting things about this book is that you've got people who are experts in so many different disciplines: traditional Islamic studies, biblical studies, sociology, anthropology, missiology. And incidentally, if I may be so bold as to suggest, I think you need to add the discipline of political studies, international studies, relations, whatever it is, because I think if you're understanding Islam today, you've got to understand all the political things that are going on. But I counted 33 contributors to the book. I mean, that really is impressive. And Martin, it seems to me that you've been like a conductor of an orchestra in bringing this gang of people together and play this music, this beautiful music together. But I would say, in answer to the question, obviously reading the Bible in our own context, but being challenged by people in other contexts who can see more clearly, perhaps, than we can, what's going on in our context. All those 33 people are writing from a different context: Africa, India, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Morocco. Everyone is in a different context, and we really got to listen to the challenge from people in other contexts who may be able to see more objectively what we're doing and the dangers of what we're doing.
Absolutely. And Dan and Ida, who were there at the conference, do you feel, have you gained any converts during that consultation? Have any people who were more, let's say, polemical, been won over to a little bit softer approach? Are you aware of something like that happening, or maybe the other way around? What do you think, Dan?
Well, if there were any converts to this kind of approach, none of them have shared that with me, I don't think. In some ways, the conference may have been somewhat self-selecting in terms of people who were already open to thinking in these kinds of ways. Although, at the conference itself, quite predictably, there are differences that show up, and some people are, partly because of their own context, are going to be a lot more uncomfortable with certain kinds of approaches than others. We have to allow for the divergence of people's experience, the kinds of pain they may have experienced in the past that orient them in a particular direction with regard to Islam, with regard to their experience of it. And so that's all just part of the mix as far as dealing with this. So I wouldn't have, there probably were some people who were moved along one way or another. I can't give you specific examples though.
Thank you.
And several people shared with me who had become much more accepting of themselves and of their own background, whether they were coming from a Muslim background or from other backgrounds. And one that I very vividly remember was somebody who's been doing peacemaking between Muslims and Christians, who shared that she had realized that to leave out the Jews from that peacemaking process in the Middle Eastern region was problematic, and she committed herself to including the Jews in the peacemaking process wherever she could.
Okay, and thank you for giving a little bit of insight to those who weren't there about those two consultations. I'd like to take another question from our audience. This one comes from Sam Hanna, who says that, and I'm summarizing, we've spent most of our time during this session speaking about the epistemology behind the initiatives, which he appreciates, but he's asking, can you reflect a bit more on the methodology of the book? And so what would you say is unique perhaps about this methodology? So he heard me speak about Christ-centric rather than Christianity-focused. Can we say a bit more about how this can be achieved from a methodological perspective? Ida, would you like to say a bit on that?
Yes, for me, one of the key methodologies is that you're putting together the academic insights with the more practical insights and the devotional insights. And I think that is something that drives it in a very Christocentric direction. So the biblical reflections that you have were designed to take us devotionally to Scripture, and that's sure to push you in a direction of appreciating Jesus. And Scripture does not tend to deal with Christianity, but with our relationship with God and dealing with our sins and all that kind of stuff. And then the practical is again and again taking you back to or forward to the real life situations and the real life people. And the people that you had lined up were people who would identify themselves much more as followers of Jesus than by their Christian label. And so putting that in conversation with the different academic disciplines was a key part of the methodology.
Yes. And in fact, we near the end of the editorial process, we decided to convey a lot of the conversation panels that have taken place during these consultations and rewrite them in a sort of creative way, giving ourselves a lot of freedom in doing so. And in order to do that, we actually created 3 characters, and that these were a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim, 3 of them disciples of Jesus. And so, and we called them Christian background disciple, Muslim background disciple, Jewish background disciple. And by doing that, we intentionally were saying Christians also have a background, and not by being born a Christian doesn't necessarily mean that you are a disciple. And so this kind of equates us perhaps, and we come back to this this equal plane where we start off from, and then what does discipleship mean? I want to bring in yet another question, or a combination a little bit of a few questions, which I think are important to ask of the 3 of you, because all 3 of you are Western scholars. And if I may ask Colin, perhaps initially, as a Western scholar, how do you engage in the study of Islam and Eastern culture without falling into what some people have labeled as Orientalism? And Edward Said, with his book Orientalism, has left us with a very strong legacy with a lot of positive things, but also disturbing things for anyone who is an outsider to Islam yet would like to study Islam. And that probably applies to any outsider studying another religious tradition. Colin, how do you deal with this historical heritage, and how do you present Islam and Eastern culture without falling into the traps of Orientalism, or what has been criticized as Orientalism?
I think the first thing I would say is that all of this has to start with actual relationships with real life Muslims in actual situations. I can remember a conversation with a Muslim in Bethlehem, just outside the Church of the Nativity. I can remember conversations with people in Beirut, in Bristol and Birmingham. So everything starts with the actual Muslim person or people that you're talking with. You've got to relate to them. And incidentally, one of the problems that I have with some aspects of the book is that you're emphasizing a much more positive picture of Muhammad and the origins of Islam. And I would say all the time you've got to concentrate on the actual Muslim that you're talking to and his or her way of thinking and his world. So I'm not thinking about the academic stuff. I'm concentrating on the person in front of me, whether that person is Lebanese, Syrian, Egyptian, Indian, or whatever they are. And the academic stuff doesn't very often come into that kind of real conversation with a real Muslim.
Thank you. That's helpful. Would anyone else like to address that? Daniel, how do you avoid those pitfalls that have been so strongly and clearly highlighted by someone like Edward Said?
Well, I've spent a good bit of my engagement with Islam actually living in the West, and in a position where I was teaching there, and so in I think a classic Orientalist position in a sense, interpreting Islam to people in the West who are not Muslims, and what has been really refreshing about having lived now in Turkey for the last 8 years or so is, and one of the things that attracted me about the idea was that it seemed far more intellectually honest to be studying Islam in an environment in which I was regularly and always engaged with Muslims, and especially Muslim scholars. So I think, this is another variation on what Colin has just said, that it's in the course, in the context of relationship, that we can escape these traps. It's very easy living in the West, speaking to, Western audiences who know very little about Islam, to go off in directions that my Muslim friends would never recognize. And to ignore the rich and varied contexts of Islam. It can be very hard not to essentialize, whereas living in Muslim communities with Muslims and engaging in a regular way, I think helps tremendously to temper those influences.
Okay, so basically, your Islam is not only a subject or even an object of study, which leads to this sort of objectification, but in a way a partner in study and a journey, and there are real persons that you are engaging with. That's and perhaps a somewhat related question. Someone has asked, how have Muslim leaders responded to this book? Well, of course, we can't quite answer that, because I know that we have not invited, for instance, endorsements of the book from Muslim scholars. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe we should have done that as well. But I'm sure there will be responses once it comes to the market. So maybe let me change that question a bit and say, how do you expect some of your Muslim friends and scholar friends, as well as non-scholar friends, how do you think they will respond to this book? Aida, what do you think?
Yes.
Kabir,
Actually, one of the criticisms I did have of the book that I should have voiced earlier was I was disappointed that the Muslims who addressed the college, who addressed the conference, didn't have their articles in the book.
Yes, and we considered it at some point, but it actually, for more technical reasons, it became very difficult and impractical to do so, rather than, so it was not a theological decision, but more a practical decision.
Yeah. My guess is that there'll be a number of Muslims who are really pleased with it, not because they agree with it, but because they're glad that the Christians are actually asking these questions and thinking about it. But there'll be a big range of responses. So I'll be interested to see. But I've no doubt we'll make lots of mistakes. We all fall into lots of pitfalls. And I think the important thing is that we recognize that this book, like all of us as individuals, are putting in our own small contribution from our own perspective. But I do hope, though, that one of the things that your study center has represented is a place where you do actually listen to Muslims. And that's one of the things we do in Oxford or in Houston, that we actually very seldom do things where there are no Muslims around with us. So
Dan,
let's.
yeah, your friends in Istanbul?
Well, I quite deliberately sent copies of my chapters while I was working on them to Muslim colleagues, asking for input. I didn't really consider it a good thing to go ahead with presentations like this without input. So actually, one of them I sent to Shabir in Oxford because I dealt quite specifically with his work. I'm not sure if he was fully honest in his response to me. I hope he was, but he was very positive about it. And so didn't have any objections to what I had said. And then an academic colleague here in Istanbul, I got input on the other chapter. And I think that is something I would encourage of anyone who is writing seriously about Islam. That is, if at all possible, engage in the process of writing with Muslim colleagues. Keeps you honest.
Yes. Very, very good advice. And even if you're not writing, if you're speaking, perhaps think that you have your favorite Muslim friend in the audience and see how you can do it honestly without causing offense, because you do not want to offend a friend that you love and respect. I would like to bring this conversation to a close with a final question, and I'd like to ask each of you to reflect just 30 seconds in closing. So, you know, we can just keep it simple. But Europe has had a few traumatic experiences in the past few weeks. You know, what has happened in France because of these caricatures again, and the French teacher who was killed in Austria and in other places in Europe. There's been a stirring up again of violence. And these sorts of events, as we all know, are quick to ruin everything that we do, everything that a book like this book would claim or would pretend to be doing. If a book like that cannot address this sort of thing, if it cannot help, you know, address reality, then there's no point to it. So could you reflect in really 30 to 40 seconds, in what way does a book like this help us interpret, but also help the church as it addresses the sort of thing that has happened in France or in Austria? Why don't we start with Colin?
Martin, I would say that this is where the one discipline that was missing from the conference was political science, or whatever you like to call it. Just think of the coup in Iran in 1953, where the CIA and MI5 brought down the first democratically elected government in Iran. And that was followed by the return of the Shah, which was eventually followed by Khomeini and so on. How many people in the West really understand the history of the Middle East in the last 200 years? The effect of Zionism, the effect of the war in Iraq, the invasion of Libya. Refugees are pouring across the Mediterranean, partly because of the mess that we made in Libya. I don't think people in the West are going to really be able to grapple with these things until they face up to their role in the history and the politics. The BLM, the British, the Black Lives Matter movement, has forced people to be very much more critical about our history in certain parts of the world. But has it forced people in the West to be more critical about what we have done in the Middle East? And I would say that's a major thing that has been missing from the discussion in Europe in recent months.
Okay, so in a sense, you're saying having a biblical way of understanding Islam, Muslims, Muhammad, the Quran, it has a role, but is not sufficient in order to address some of the critical
Exactly.
situations in our societies today. Yeah, Daniel, do you feel that this book has something to offer to these sorts of situations?
Well, actually, I think Ida actually has made one of the strongest contributions to thinking in that way by her emphasis from Genesis on the normalizing of human experience in a biblical framework, including violence and religious violence. That is, they should not be unexpected to us. They're not something that somehow has come out of nowhere, or that the biblical framework gives us no reason to expect, or no tools to think about. So that's the first thing. And the other thing I would say as an historian is that I tend to think in historical terms about these things. That is, religious violence is not something, as Colin has said, that just springs out of nowhere. It springs from particular context, particular political circumstances. And so the effort that's been made in the book not to essentialize Islam, not to essentialize Muslims, not to see them all in a single sort of a bundle or ideology, is actually very helpful, I think, to help us to separate those things out.
Yes, thank you. So there is hope that this book can help a little bit to help in these situations. Thank you. And Ida, would you like to close with your thoughts on that?
Maybe the book can help us to be biblical and Christ-centered. Maybe it can help us to process our own responses when things like this happen and put them through biblical and Christ-like lenses, so that instead of simply reacting from our gut, we're able to acknowledge our own outrage, our own responses. We're able to see that the problem is actually sin, whether it's in us, whether it's in the other. I love Karen Shaw's paper, which underlines what Paul has to say about the Jews and the Gentiles, but which could equally be said about the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, the Hindus, and everybody else, that we're all sinners. And maybe if we put that together with something of the understanding of the mixed political background, we can begin to move forward to see what it actually means to be a disciple of Jesus and to be disciples of Jesus together in this context. Maybe.
Thank you for these possibilities and for being able to look beyond the book, which is just one effort on a long journey for the church today. I want to thank you very, very much, Ida, Colin, Daniel, for joining us in this conversation. I want to heartily thank our audience. We have just a little over 120 who have made it to the end of this conversation. I want to thank our support team who have done a fantastic job supporting this event technically and professionally. As soon as we end this conversation, a link to a brief survey is going to appear on your screen. And so we would urge you, please, to take a couple of minutes, it's very brief, to provide us with your feedback on the event. This helps us to understand how people experience these sorts of gatherings that are new to all of us, these virtual gatherings. I also want to let you know that the recording of this conversation will be available to the public, and we will be sharing it through our social media probably within a week, no doubt. By next week, there will be the video as well as an accompanying commentary in a blog sort of way that we will produce at our institution. So please share it with friends, invite others, and go back to it and reflect some more. Thank you so much. Please don't forget, give us a few minutes of your time. When this seminar closes, a very brief survey will appear on your screen. Thank you for taking it and filling it out. And goodbye from Beirut and Amman and London and Oxford and everywhere else in the world.